Let's continue our discussion of Judaism. Last time we were talking about rituals that are a part of Judaism, including circumcision and keeping of the Sabbath. Remember, the Sabbath for Jews is Saturday. Technically, the Sabbath begins on sundown on Friday, and it continues until you can see stars on Saturday night. And circumcision was not a ritual that the Israelites were the first to participate in. Circumcision predates Judaism, but the Jewish community at the time, who were the Israelites, they decided that they were going to adopt this ritual as a sign of the covenant between God and their community. Circumcision is an interesting ritual. So today in the United States, we have separation of church and state, which protects religious freedom. And you can see here is a report from BBC from 2012. A German court rules that circumcision is bodily harm. So it's true that in our country we have religious freedom, as I mentioned. However, there are limits on this religious freedom. For instance, I cannot begin a religion of my own where when we go to temple or church or the mosque once a week, we sacrifice innocent children as a part of our weekly ritual. I couldn't say, but this is my religion. So there are limits to the practices of religion, and this German court argued that circumcision goes beyond a reasonable practice, and they're arguing that it's harmful. So if you think about it, it's severing part of the body. And to put it in perspective, if instead of severing the foreskin of the penis, if it were severing the tip of the earlobe, that would seem quite strange. Imagine if one started a religion and it was the practice to sever part of the earlobe. I'm not sure that our country would protect that sort of ritual. It would be too harmful. In general, we have First Amendment rights, which protect our freedoms, but there's still limits to what we can do, what we can say. For instance, you cannot slander, you cannot say libelous things about another person. So that is to say really nasty, untrue things that are going to harm their reputation or prevent them from holding down a job, for instance, or from acquiring money. You can't shout fire in a crowded theater. You have limits of your free speech if you're flying. And this is because if free speech becomes so harmful, we as a country decided that we need to place a limit on that free speech. So is circumcision harmful enough that it should be restricted? Even religious freedom wouldn't cover it. At least this German court says it should be restricted. And one of the counter arguments is that there's a functional aspect to circumcision. It can, for instance, prevent the transmission of HIV, AIDS, and other STDs. Now, there is some evidence that if you live in a hotbed where there's lots of HIV, AIDS present, and we're lucky in our country we don't have that, but in other countries in the world there is really a problem with how many people have HIV/AIDS, and there's been some evidence, I believe, that if circumcision is introduced into that culture, then that can have some impact on the spread. I don't know how significant it is, but it can have some impact on that spread. But if you don't, in our country, that's it's not an issue. We don't have enough. We have people that have HIV and AIDS in our country, but the percentage is so low that the circumcision, the benefit you get might be negligible. So you got to weigh the drawbacks, and you got to weigh the benefits. And so the drawback is you're losing part of a very sensitive area of the body. And many would argue that there's evidence, scientific evidence, that there's a loss of sensation and pleasure. So that's a big factor. And so what are you getting for that loss of pleasure? Another negative factor is it's painful. Infants cry. You say, well, they don't remember it. Well, does that mean I can do anything to a child? You know, I can do all these terrible, nasty, painful things, and the argument is, well, they don't remember, so I can get away with it. So that doesn't seem to be a fair counter argument. Also, you're not letting the person decide. You're deciding before they have matured enough to make decisions. And so that's not fair. You should wait until they have matured, until at least they're in adolescence, if not, adulthood, 17, 18 years old or so, and they can make the decision. Another argument in favor of circumcision is that it's cleaner, and it's for sanitary reasons. Circumcision is a plus. That it can prevent the accumulation of bacteria. But then the reply to that is, as long as you wash, that you could get the accumulation of bacteria in all sorts of areas of your body if you don't have good hygiene. You can get sick and get bacteria if you don't wash your body. So as long as you regularly clean all parts of your body, including if you have foreskin, then that's not really an issue. And so that's why this German court probably banned circumcision. On the first slide of our lecture, we had the Star of David. David was the first effective king for these people. He captured Jerusalem and made it the capital for the Israelites. So today, Jerusalem is the capital of the state of Israel. He's considered to be the greatest king in the Jewish tradition, greater than even his son Solomon, even though it was his son Solomon who built the most famous temple in Judaism. So Solomon was David's son and successor, and David wanted to build the temple, but God forbid it, and it was Solomon who built the temple. Now, that temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Then it was rebuilt, and that second temple, or that reconstruction temple, was destroyed, except for one wall, by the Romans in 70 CE. And one wall is still standing today. You can go visit it. It's called the Wailing Wall, and I have some images for you that we'll see in a second. So after Solomon, the nation of Israel splits. That's in 922 BCE. It splits into the north and the south. The southern nation is known as Judah. Remember, one of the children of Jacob is named Judah, and Jacob was known as Israel. And again, that temple, Solomon's temple, was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. Then a second temple, or a reconstruction temple, was built. That was years later, in about 500 BCE. and that stood in fully intact until 70 CE, and then it was destroyed, as I mentioned, except for one wall, by the Romans. The Romans were the ones who destroyed the temple, except for one wall. And again, as I mentioned, I have some images of that Wailing Wall for you in just a little bit. Another factor of this religion I want you to know about is synagogue, which is related to temple. So some Jews will say I'm going to temple, some will say I'm going to synagogue. They're sort of the same meaning, a little bit different. Synagogue literally means assembly, and technically all you need for a synagogue is 10 adult Jewish males. Now, to be an adult in Judaism, you just need to be 13 years old. That's when the Jewish rite of passage, known as a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah for girls, but that occurs at 13 years old. So for a synagogue, you need the 10 adult Jewish males, which could technically be 10 13-year-olds who have been bar mitzvahed. And then in addition to that, you need a copy of the scripture, the Torah. So that's the requirement of a synagogue. Rabbi is a leader of a synagogue or a temple, sort of like a Muslim imam or a Christian priest or pastor, and it literally means my master. So synagogue means assembly, rabbi means master. If we're going to talk about Judaism, then it makes sense that we would talk about the development of Christianity, because Christianity began as a sect of Judaism. Just like Buddhism and Jainism have roots in Hinduism, Christianity has roots in Judaism. Jesus was raised Jewish, lived as a Jew. As I mentioned, his parents were Jewish. His disciples were Jewish. Christianity drew its scripture, worship, and eschatology directly from Judaism. Eschatology includes belief about heaven and hell. By the end of the 15th century, so now we're fast forwarding a lot through a lot of the centuries here, Jews had been expelled from nearly every European nation. So for instance, in 1290, they had been expelled from England. A few years after that, expelled from France. In the 14th century, Germany had expelled Jews. And then eventually Spain in 1492 and Portugal in 1498. So they're getting kicked out of these countries. Where did they go? Well, a lot of them went to Eastern Europe, particularly Poland. So refugees turn to Eastern Europe because they are booted out of Western Europe, and a lot of them went to Poland because they were allowed to work there. And the language that many of them spoke when they were eventually forced into these ghettos. So you might say, oh, that's nice that there's a space for them in Eastern Europe, but it wasn't like they were welcomed with open arms and welcomed in normal society. A lot of them were forced into gated, crowded ghettos. And in those ghettos, the language that was often spoken was called Yiddish. Yiddish is a combination of Hebrew and German. Hebrew and Middle High German. This is where the yellow badges first come into history. So, of course, later, Nazi Germany forced Jews to wear these yellow badges with the Star of David. But that was in the 20th century. But the Nazis, they were really picking up, bringing back something that was very old. That was a tradition, not a tradition, but that was an embarrassing tactic that is from the 13th century. So there were hopes of a Messiah. You could see that a lot of the Jewish community, they were not living in good situations, and they didn't believe that Jesus was their Messiah. So they were waiting for their Messiah. Their scripture predicts one, and this would be a good time as any for Messiah to come. So here were hopes of a Messiah in a man named Shabbatai Zevi. Even his wife declared that he was a Messiah, and he was going to lead the people out of persecution, out of the ghetto. And so Shabbatai Zevi in 1665 marches into Constantinople with the purpose of dethroning the Sultan of Turkey. So remember, Constantinople is a city that eventually becomes Istanbul, which is in Turkey. And it was a Muslim nation in the 17th century. And Zevi enters it, as the Messiah. Bets were taken on whether he'd enter Jerusalem. But what happened is the Sultan says, who do you got on your side? I've got an army. You've got nobody. I don't acknowledge that you're a Messiah. In fact, you, for being so dastardly and coming to dethrone me, I decree that you are going to convert from Judaism to Islam. That's the religion of the Sultan. Instead of taking over my kingdom, it's going to be the opposite. You're not going to take over anything, and in fact, I'm going to make you convert to our religion, which is the Muslim faith. So you're going to convert or die. So what do you think happened? Well, the fact that many of you have never heard of Zevi is a clue that he converted, and that crushed the hopes of him being a Messiah. You can't be a Messiah if you convert away from the religion that you are allegedly supposed to be a leader of. In the early 1900s, many Jewish settlements cropped up in Palestine. So there is a lot of controversy over this small bit of land that is northeast of Egypt and south of Turkey and west of Jordan. So there's a country known as Israel there. There is an area known as Palestine, and some say it's a country, and there's these zones or regions, and there is a lot of conflict over who's in charge of this area, and it goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So here's one piece of the puzzle, one important part of the story. So we know that millennia ago, you had David and Solomon who had these nations, but then things change, and a country and a people known as Palestine, the Palestinians, were at least living in this area. So in the early 20th century, a lot of Jews are settling in Palestine. 1909, you have settlement known as Tel Aviv, so that is kind of the financial capital of Israel today. And then over the years, more and more settlements come up in Palestine. So if you look at the numbers, it was mostly Palestinians. There still were Jews and Christians, and it was kind of a very diverse area. But then the numbers of Jews start flowing in, and the balance of who has more of the population starts to shift. So at first, there was acceptance that these people needed a place to go. They were exiled from Western Europe, and they went to Poland and Eastern Europe, and then they're getting there are these terrible ghettos and prejudices, and so they leave Eastern Europe, and so a lot of them go to Palestine. So 1920, about 50,000 Jews that had migrated to Palestine. With the end of World War I, Palestine became governed by the mandate of the British. So this is 1917. This is the Balfour Declaration. Remember, the British are the ones who are in control of Palestine. You could say that Palestine was occupied by this imperial colonial force, Great Britain. So in 1917, the British they declare His Majesty's, that's the King of Britain, His Majesty's King of England, His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. So a lot of Palestinians said, wait a second, this is our country. What are you going around saying that it's going to be a national home for the Jewish people? That's not fair. So as I mentioned, the native population of Palestine react. 1928, the numbers increase. You got 100,000 Jews in Palestine. So once the king made that decree, the Balfour Declaration, then you get a lot of immigration into Palestine. 100,000 1928, 175,000, 31, 33, 220,000. 1939, the British government set a quota because the Palestinians are saying, "What are you doing? Oh my gosh, there's not enough room, or this is our land," and so to deal with those qualms, the British government says, okay, we'll limit the amount, we'll put a quota, a max on how many people could go in, 15,000 a year for the next 5 years. But this is problematic because if you know your history, in 1939, this is when Jews needed to flee Europe because of Nazi Germany, right? The Holocaust, the concentration camps are starting. The machine of the Nazi Germans and Hitler is starting to rev up. So they need to get out of Europe, and they're fleeing to Eastern Europe. But then for prejudices, and then the Nazis, they needed to get out of there, so they're going to Palestine. But now they're saying, no, you can go, but we got these quotas, so it's not looking good historically at this time. So now we got to talk. If you're going to talk about Judaism, unfortunately, we have to talk about this one of the greatest tragedies in the last few centuries, the Holocaust. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. He began an anti-Semitic Nazi dictatorship. Little by little, the rights of Jews in Germany were stripped away. They could not vote. They couldn't hold office. They couldn't work in most professions. They weren't allowed to marry non-Jews. And because of the quotas, Palestine's virtually closed. Many tried to flee. Hitler brought the yellow badges back. And then, once you get into the 1940s, you have the euphemism of the final solution. That's the concentration camps, the Holocaust. The death toll, as you know from your history classes, is in the millions. Approximately 6 million Jews were murdered at the hands of Hitler and the Nazis in the 1940s. And a very sad note, no attempt was made by the Allied bombers, including England and the United States, to wreck the machinery of the Holocaust. Methodically, Jews in the death camps were driven into gas chambers and asphyxiated. How could this happen? It was sort of Nazi madness. People were rallying around each other. Extreme German nationalism. Germany, after World War I, was really in a dire times, and they were looking for scapegoats, and so the Jews were part of that scapegoat, and then also modern efficiency. So that's how you get to that 6 million number. This crazy nationalism, the aftermath of World War II, the look for a scapegoat, and because of technology, with weaponry advancing, that's how you could get a death toll of 6 million. Believe it or not, the Holocaust reduced the world population of Jews by a third, approximately. Now, if you're a Jewish person, you might be thinking, wait a second, there's supposed to be a covenant between God and our people. How could this happen? We're supposed to be the chosen people. And I don't have an easy answer for you. You could say that there's a plan, God works in mysterious ways. A lot of people just lost their faith. So this is one of the main impetuses for the creation of Israel, is that after this horrific, nasty, terrible, unthinkable event that was the Holocaust, the Jewish people, they needed a homeland. So in 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. So you might be thinking, why is the United Nations getting involved? I thought England controlled Palestine. Well, they did, but then eventually they handed over some or all the power of Palestine to the United Nations, which was brand new at that time. And so, as one of their first actions, they decide that they're going to partition Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. This is UN Resolution number 181. So I'm not an expert in Israel or Palestine. I know as much as I am teaching you now. So I'm going to appeal to one of my colleagues who is an expert. So this is a quote from him, Dr. Matt Weiss. After years of Arab and Jewish violence, the British threw their hands up in the air, turned the question over to the UN, who drew up a partition plan, UN Resolution 181, and presented it to both sides. The Zionist Jews will receive about 55% of the land, and Palestinians approximately 45%. So if you're a Palestinian, you're saying, wait a second, this is supposed to be 100% ours, and now we have less than half. The Zionist side accepted it. So the Zionist side, that's the more or less the Jewish side, on the premise that half a loaf is better than none at all, whereas Palestinians categorically rejected it. Their argument was it was grossly unfair that the Zionists should receive more than half the land when they only constituted about 35% of the population. Moreover, they claimed that the Zionist enterprise was illegitimate because its success had relied on the meddling of a colonial power, Britain. So they're arguing that, whoa, this whole resolution is based on the colonialism and the unfair conquering of sorts of our land by the British. So anything that is rooted in the British control is categorically unfair. And shady land acquisitions that led to the eviction of a fair number of Palestinian peasants. So if you want to watch a video on this history, if you want to learn more, then, well, actually, instead of being a recommendation, I'm saying you should, you must watch this video. So this is so do a web search for Conflict in Israel and Palestine, Crash Course World History 222. There's a lot of good videos from John Green. So it's a lot of good videos on history and literature. He is himself a well-known author. Here's another website that does a good job of explaining the roots of the recent violence between Israelis and Palestinians. Here you can see the Wailing Wall. It's right here, the Western Wall. And there are two Muslim mosques that are very sacred. You've got the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount, this golden dome here, and then you have another very sacred mosque. So these very holy sites in this very holy city of Jews, Christians, and Muslims, they couldn't be closer to one another. So part of the aftermath of this UN Resolution 181 is it's a civil war was the stage was set, which drew in neighboring Arab states. And between 1947 and 1949, there's a running debate concerning whether Palestinians ought to have accepted the partition plan. Some say that even if it wasn't fair, at least they would have had some territory. So now Palestinians don't even have 45%. They have 10, 15%. They don't have rights to the water, which of course in that desert region is very important. So if they only would have, even if it wasn't fair, if they just would have accepted that 45%, then they would have been better off as they are today. But hindsight's 2020. The UN plan is far more generous than anything that's been offered since, even though there might be some merit in the argument, one has to wonder whether Israel would have respected that kind of deal and whether it would have been a stable settlement. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the pre-state Zionist movement, was intent on controlling as much territory as he could with as few Arabs as possible, and there's abundant evidence to suggest that he only saw the partition plan as a stepping stone toward an even larger Jewish entity. So you could argue that they needed to reject the 45-55 plan because they could see the players, and even if they would have accepted it, it wouldn't have held for long because there were Zionists even before the official... by the way, Zion is Israel. I don't know if I've said that yet. And Zionists are people who are pro-Israel. That they could see the writing on the wall, and that this expansion of this new state, because of the backing of colonial powers and the UN and other kind of extensions in the West, they needed to kind of protest from the beginning, because the partition plan was a stepping stone towards an even larger Jewish entity, which now it is. As some might say, that Israel's annexation of huge chunks of territory in the 40s to the 60s, far beyond the territory that was accorded to them in the partition plan, vindicates the Palestinians' fears that the Israeli appetite for land would not be satiated by the kind of territorial compromise the partition plan offered. Here's a little bit of good news. After all that bad news, Israeli Cafe offers 50% off to Arabs and Jews who eat together. So there are small movements towards peace, at least today. So 1967, things come to a head. There's an Arab-Israeli war. It's also known as the Six-Day War. More Arab territories were occupied by the Israelis, including the old city of Jerusalem, one of the most sacred shrines, to all Jews. So we've got the Wailing Wall, which I've talked about, the portion of that temple that remained after the Romans that war in 70 CE, which is right next to the oldest Muslim temple, the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. So here's another image. Here's the Wailing Wall. You can see people down praying to it. They go to visit it. They'll put little prayers in it. And right on the other side of the wall, basically, is the oldest Muslim mosque, the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. So here's another close-up image of the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall. You can see lots of people, probably mostly Jews, that are going there to pray against the wall. Hundreds of years old. Here's another image. Here's a famous celebrity touching the wall, Zach Braff, famous American actor who is Jewish. Here's more images of the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount. Beautiful architecture. Here it is again. And here's a map of more or less present-day Israel and Palestine. So this lighter tan color is Israel, and this darker tan with these dotted lines, those are the two Palestinian territories. In the west, that's on the bank of the Mediterranean, is the Gaza Strip, which is run by Hamas, and then in this eastern, even though it's called the West Bank, you've got it's the eastern side of the Israel, which is confusing. So why? It's in the east. Why is it called the West Bank? Well, because it's on the east. It's the west bank of the Jordan River. So the Jordan River separates Israel from, no surprise, Jordan. That's run by the Palestinian Authority. So you've got Hamas running the Gaza Strip and the West Bank run by the Palestinian Authority. And there are some corruption issues about those governments, and that there's some mistreating of the Palestinian people by their own leaders. To complicate things, here we zoom in on the Gaza Strip, and here we zoom in on the West Bank. You can see this gray area. Who's in charge of it? Well, that depends on who you ask. You see the old city of Jerusalem right smack in the middle. If you look at the largest religions in the world, Judaism is nowhere near being top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's actually a smaller religion in terms of numbers. Now, we know that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, but even if you counted those numbers, you'd still be only in the millions. The largest religion in the world is Christianity, which has over 2 billion, then Islam, which has over 1.5 billion, and then Hinduism, then Buddhism. Then you have to go down a lot more other religions until you get to Judaism, about 14 million Jews in the world. The highest concentration is actually not in Israel, it is in New York City, in terms of concentration. More than 1.8 million Jews live in New York City. It's the largest concentration of Jews anywhere in the world. It's a safe place for them to live. Here are some Orthodox Jews. You can see the covering of the head and the growing out of some parts of the hair, the sideburn, and the clothes that they're wearing. Let's talk about sects of Judaism. So Orthodox, that's a very large group. In this group, in worship, men and women are separated in the synagogue, and both men and women must cover their heads. So we'll talk about the kippah or the yarmulke that a lot of Jewish men wear, and if you are Orthodox, women cover their heads too. Hebrew is the language of worship. Then we have the conservatives. So believe it or not, the Orthodox group is the most conservative, and the conservative group is not as conservative as the Orthodox group. I know that's confusing, but that's the way it is. Men are required to cover their heads with the traditional skull cap, which is known as a kippah or yarmulke. Yes, that's the spelling of yarmulke during worship. So you might be wondering, what's with these two different names? Well, it depends. Are you looking at the Hebrew word, or are you looking at the Yiddish word? So guess, which of those do you think is Hebrew and which do you think is Yiddish? Kippah is the Hebrew word, and yarmulke is the Yiddish word. Remember, Yiddish is a language that was been spoken for a long time, and we saw it in Poland, in the ghettos, centuries ago, and it's a mix of German and Hebrew. Men are required to cover their heads with the kippah. Conservatives tend to worship on Saturday morning as opposed to Friday evening when the Sabbath begins. So in Reform Judaism, men and women sit together and uncover their heads. This is the most liberal sect of Judaism. The language they speak is a language of the people. So if it were a Jewish temple in Los Angeles or in the San Francisco Bay Area, then you would speak English. But if it were a temple in Mexico, then they would speak Spanish. We're going to talk a lot about kosher law, kosher rules. Kosher is not strictly followed by Reform Jews. They're the least conservative. And you can have female rabbis. By the way, in general, all rabbis are allowed to marry, regardless of which sect we're talking about. Worship is usually Friday evenings, and its synagogues are called temples. So remember, the Sabbath is Saturday, but technically it starts on sundown on Friday. So what are some kosher laws? Well, pork, pig in general, is taboo, forbidden. Lobster, oysters, shrimp, clams, crabs, shellfish in general, all forbidden. How about beef, chicken, and turkey, and tuna? They're all allowed. You cannot mix meat with dairy. You're not allowed to ignite a fire on the Sabbath. So that means no turning on electricity. No, can't ride in a car on the Sabbath. Again, Sabbath is sunset technically to the next sunset, which is Saturday, when you can see 3 stars. Shabbat is the Yiddish name for the Sabbath. So there's a big dinner that's held for many Reform Jews on Friday evening called the Shabbat dinner. And that's when the best meal is served. All blood must be drained from meat and poultry before it's eaten. Fruits and vegetables must be inspected for bugs. Bugs cannot be eaten. Fish, eggs, fruits, vegetables, and grains can be eaten with meat or with dairy. Grape products made by non-Jews may not be eaten or consumed. Utensils, including pots and pans and other cooking surfaces that have come into contact with meat may not be used with dairy, and vice versa. So as a result, there's a lot of companies that cater to Jewish communities, and they will sell kosher food. Here's even a kosher McDonald's. So you're not going to find a lot of cheeseburgers there, and you won't find any sausage, which is, at least not any pork sausage. Here we have former President Bill Clinton, who is wearing a kippah or yarmulke, and you can see the flag of Israel in the back. If you listen to the speeches of presidents, a lot of them will say that Israel is the United States' closest ally. Here's Barack Obama visiting the Wailing Wall, also wearing a yarmulke. More famous actors who happen to be Jewish, Adam Sandler. Jewish holy days. Well, the Sabbath, again, begins Friday at sundown, continues until you can see 3 stars on Saturday at dusk. Traditionally, the best food of the week is served at the Friday evening meal. On Friday night, you have the Kiddush. That's the benediction over the wine or bread, the challah. The lighting of the the lighting and blessing of the Sabbath candles by the woman of the house. That's what's traditional. Here is an image of that bread, the challah. Very tasty bread, if you haven't had it. Another holy day, Passover and Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is a Jewish New Year. Passover we talked about when we were talking about the Exodus. Passover is in the month of Nisan. That's on the lunar calendar, so that will sometimes be in March, sometimes April. It's on the 15th. It lasts for 8 days. You have that meal I described, the Seder meal, the Passover meal. And 3 of the components I want you to know about are the lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs. Remember, the lamb is important because the blood that was drained from the sacrifice of the lamb, that's marked on the doorpost so that the angel of death will pass over that home and not kill the firstborn child or firstborn son on some accounts. The unleavened bread, they didn't have time to let the yeast rise, so it was basically flat bread because they had to get out of there. They had to leave. The madness, escape their slavery, their bondage, and the bitter herbs because it was a bittersweet moment. Bitter because of the death and destruction, sweet because they were being liberated from slavery. The Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, first and second months of a month called Tishri, and that is sometimes September, sometimes October. The most holy, sacred day in the Jewish tradition is Yom Kippur. It's the Jewish Day of Atonement. When you atone for something, you are ruminating, reflecting on your life and your deeds. You think about the mistakes that you have made, and you atone for your mistakes, what some might call sins. And you'll spend the day in the temple. You'll abstain from work and food and drink. You'll pray, asking for forgiveness of sins and reconciliation. The day is often spent in the synagogue or temple. 10th day of Tishri, which is the end of the period of penitence begun at Rosh Hashanah. So the Jewish New Year and Yom Kippur, are close in proximity. Another holiday that some of you might have heard of, probably because of its proximity to a Christian holiday, Christmas, is Hanukkah. And so there you have the 2 spellings with the H if it is the Hebrew spelling, and with the C if you have the Yiddish spelling. That can be in November, sometimes December, because of the lunar calendar, the 25th day of Kislev. The spelling with the C is based on a Romanization spelling. So during Hanukkah, there is candles that are set on what's called a menorah. There are 9 of these candles. The 9th candle is called the Shamash. The Shamsh, and it's used to light the others, a ninth candle to light the others. The other 8 represent the 8 nights of Hanukkah, and it celebrates a miracle that happened in 165 BCE. Judas Maccabeus reclaimed the temple from the Syrian Greeks. And he had only one small container of oil. It should have only lasted a few hours or one night, but miraculously it lasted 8 nights. Hanukkah has been a minor holiday in Judaism until fairly recent times. It has become increasingly important for Jews in the United States because of its proximity to Christmas. So if you go to Israel, Hanukkah is a very minor holiday. The big holiday is Yom Kippur, which is big in the United States too, but because of American consumerism and American obsession with Christmas, Hanukkah for Jews has kind of become a bigger thing. And there are even things like presents exchange, which is not traditional. Hanukkah trees, not traditional. Here's an image of a menorah. You could see that the 9 slots for candles, the one in the middle is the shamsh, which is used to light the other. You light one per day for the 8 nights of Hanukkah. Another holiday or ritual, the bar mitzvah. So that's a Jewish rite of passage of boys entering into adulthood. It can happen as early as 13. The boy is prepared for the occasion by several years of instruction in his religion and in the language of Hebrew. He reads from the scripture at synagogue and may deliver a speech. This is a rite of passage that was reserved for boys into adulthood, but for Reform Jews, they have this ritual for girls entering into womanhood, and that's a bat mitzvah, and that happens at age 12. So there's specification for young man when he receives many presents from friends. So it's a big celebration afterwards. And as I mentioned, the more modern version, the bat mitzvah for Reform Jews. But that happens at age 12 for girls instead of 13, traditionally. In a Jewish wedding ceremony, you will have a kiddushin, that's the wedding process, a ceremony. You might wish the bride and groom mazel tov, good luck. You have the chuppah, which is the wedding ceremony canopy, creating a home together. You have the breaking of the glass, stepping on the glass. Good luck, mazel tov. The marriage will last as long as the glass has been broken. Well, if you break a glass, can you unbreak it? No. So it's pretty much a forever kind of thing. So that's an interesting metaphor and image. And you'll see the wearing of the yarmulke or the kippah, and a prayer shawl, which is called a talit. That's all I have for you on Judaism.